So I'm thrilled as the Dean of Rockefeller College to welcome you all to our distinguished panel of experts on U.S. politics. And we are here today to discuss the recent momentous developments in the 2024 presidential election campaign. What I'm going to do is introduce our panel in the order in which we will speak, and we're going to make sure to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion. Can't promise that we will be able to answer all of your questions, but we will do our best to help sort all of this out. Given the number of people that we have participating in today's event, I'm going to ask that you use the chat function for questions if you are able to do so. If not, you can use the raise hand function and I will try to catch you as I can. I'll just remind everybody that people are really invested in these issues, understandably. What we're hoping today is to provide you all with the best analysis that we can in a rapidly shifting environment. And as you're participating, just keep in mind that our audience likely spans the political spectrum broadly, and that civil disagreement is a healthy part of liberal democracy. And I also just wanted to note that we will be recording this session. So the order of the program today is that I will kick us off by talking about some of the legal angles that are emerging. I'll then turn to Cammie Bolin, who's an assistant professor of political science. Then we will hear from Sally Friedman, who's an associate professor of political science. Then to Justin Zimmerman, an assistant professor of political science. And finally, Tim Weaver, an associate professor of political science. And then we will be able to have some time to talk and hopefully clear up anything that we can for you in this interesting moment. So in addition to being Dean of Rockefeller College, I study the US courts. I've done some work recently on the Supreme Court, and I've looked at the historical comparisons to some of the things that are happening today. So one of the things that has come up most recently is the question about what happens when you have a primary process that goes through to the point where a candidate has racked up enough delegates to be the presumptive nominee, and then you have a situation where that person ends up stepping aside. There's been some news that the Republican Party intends to launch several different legal challenges to the replacement of the replacement of Joe Biden on the ballot with Kamala Harris. Legal experts, however, who have looked at election law pretty thoroughly, agree that this is a fairly unlikely path for success for the Republican Party. Why? The most important point to note is that as of right now, no one is on the ballot yet for the Democratic presidential slot because the Democratic Party has not yet chosen their nominee. Now, we've seen a number of the delegates coming forward and saying they're pledging themselves to Harris. But the nomination process will take place either through a quick roll call vote in the next week or so, or at the Democratic convention itself. And it is only at that point that the Democratic Party won't have a nominee. The states set rules for placing candidates on the ballot, and usually the rule is that they simply place the nominated candidate of each party on the ballot. Until the 1960s, party nominees were often chosen by insiders rather than by the voters. Now, delegates are presumptively tied to electoral results, but the DNC has a rule that says specifically delegates to the National Convention pledged to a presidential candidate shall in all good conscience reflect the sentiments of those who elected them. Should this go to litigation, and I expect that it will, one thing that the Democratic Party might turn to was a 1972 case around that election, in which there was a bitterly contested primary with several candidates, most prominently Hubert Humphrey and George McGovern. The Democratic Party Credentials Committee recommended unseating some delegates based on their interpretation of party rules. but the Supreme Court emphasized its unwillingness to get involved in these types of issues. Just a quick quote from that case. For nearly a century and a half, national political parties themselves have determined controversies regarding the seating of delegates to their conventions. And I would expect, even if you do get a district court here and there that rules that the Republicans would have standing to challenge the placement of Harris on the ballot, that those challenges would not survive upper levels of review. Another angle that's come forward quite recently is that the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, announced that the Republican Party had challenged, has filed a complaint with the Federal Election Commission about the transfer of funds from the Biden campaign to the Harris campaign. But again, the rules seem to pretty clearly contemplate that the funds can be released. And it should be noted that the Biden campaign was, in fact, the Biden-Harris campaign. So that continuity, again, likely shields the campaign from any kind of legal concerns. One other issue that's come up that you may have heard about is that Ohio has a law requiring a candidate to be designated by August 7th to be on the ballot. However, a bill has been signed to extend that deadline, and the governor of Ohio has indicated that he has no interest in preventing the Democrats from having a candidate on the ballot in Ohio. And the Democrats can, as I mentioned, step back and do a quick roll call vote to forestall any problems along those lines. I should note this kind of came up in the spring, and everybody was like, what? This is crazy. What were the Democrats thinking when they scheduled their convention so late? But this is actually something that has happened before. And when you have a convention that is scheduled after those deadlines, states have generally been pretty willing to go ahead and extend them. And I would expect there should be no issues with that this time. Now, those of you who follow the courts as obsessively as I do may be sitting back and saying, well, wait a minute. There have been some very interesting developments in the Supreme Court. We've seen them doing some things that would have been unusual or unprecedented in the past. What might happen in this case? Again, even with some of the decisions that the U.S. Supreme Court has made, it does seem unlikely that they would go so far as to try to rule a candidate off the ballot entirely. However, I would say that there is a potential for disruption in this strategy. And although the Republicans who are filing these suits know that according to settled law and precedent, they are very unlikely to get anywhere at upper levels of review, there are some district court judges who seem to be pretty willing to settle questions. And we may see a ruling or two that go in that unpredictable direction. Reminding you that lawsuits are often about more than just trying to win in court. And the Republicans in this case might be using lawsuits as a form of mobilization, as a way of messaging about the Harris campaign and trying to create an impression out there that she's somehow an illegitimate nominee. And also, of course, it's a big fundraising tactic to say, oh, look, we're filing suits, we're winning in court. We saw that being leveraged during 2020, and I would expect that to happen again. So that would be a reason for Republicans to go forward on this vein. Just one more quick note before I turn it over to Professor Bolin. Unprecedented gets thrown around a lot, but I know there's been some talk about J.D. Vance possibly not causing some second thoughts in the Trump campaign. There is actually precedent for swapping out a vice presidential pick after a convention. That happened in that election of 1972 when Eagleton left the Democratic ticket in favor of Sergeant Shriver. So not everything would be unprecedented in this case. So I'll just turn it over to Cammie.
Thank you so much. This is interesting for me too to hear from experts in different areas in good preparation for the classes I'll teach in the fall. So I'll focus on gender in the upcoming election. There's obviously a whole lot that can and will be said on this topic. I'll hit some highlights focusing on what research shows us, and then I'm happy to talk more about any of this in the Q&A. So I thought I would start out with just a very brief overview of what we know about gender and support for women candidates. The first is that partisanship matters more than gender in today's political world and predicting vote choice. So we heard a lot in 2016 about Hillary Clinton being this historic nominee. How would she could she sway some Republican women voters away from Donald Trump? And she did not. The vast majority of Republican women voted for the Republican candidate. So it's one example of how partisanship matters most. Research on women in politics, it does show that most of the disadvantages that women candidates face because of their gender, these disadvantages occur prior to the general election. So we know that even very young girls are socialized to think of politics as a career for men. This gap in political interest only grows as girls and boys age through high school and then through college, and even as young adults in their various professions. We also know that this socialization leads to men having higher levels of political ambition or interest in careers in politics. And we also know that women tend to underevaluate their own qualifications while men don't have the same problem. We also know that the general public does hold women candidates to higher qualification standards. So once you get to the election, the women who have made it that far, who have decided to run, who have made it through the primaries, they tend to be overqualified. So all of these factors tend to winnow the field of candidates and prevent women from running for office. But thinking about the Harris candidacy, she has overcome these barriers. We also know, and we've seen just in the past few days, that Vice President Harris has already faced a ton of sexist and racist rhetoric. Scholars who study gender stereotypes and sexism, they do find, however, that holding gendered stereotypes of what a leader looks like, this usually doesn't impact vote choice. Again, for most voters, it's partisanship that matters most. We also know, however, a lot of scholarship has looked at the relationship between sexism and racism and support for Trump. And both sexism and racism, operationalized in many different ways, predicts support for Trump and has in past elections. So this is likely to be the case again in 2024. And I know my colleague Justin will talk more about the role of race in this election in just a bit. There are a few positive early signs for the Harris campaign that I wanted to highlight. There's an article I read looking at data from vote.org where people can register to vote, where there were 40,000 new voters who registered for the first time in just the first 48 hours after Biden announced that he wasn't running again. And over 80% of these new voters are young adults. And I think that the way that Vice President Harris is focusing the issues that she is talking about on her campaign can do a lot to appeal for young voters, particularly her focus on abortion rights. Among Democratic or Democratic-leaning voters and young voters in particular, abortion rights is the top priority. The issue they care most about. And I think this is a good avenue for Harris to focus on to try to continue to encourage this excitement among younger voters. One more thing I wanted to highlight before I will turn it over to my colleague Sally. I think another avenue related to Harris's historic presidency or potential presidency, her historic nomination, is thinking about years in the future and the potential effects of her candidacy. So a lot of gender and politics scholarship looks at role model effects. Scholars have found that when women candidates run, it can increase interest and engagement in political discussion among young women in the electorate. It can get girls to rethink who can be a political leader, can also encourage people to run for office who maybe hadn't considered politics as a path before. So that's something else to watch during this election, but also in the years following this election, is what sort of effects do we have, regardless of the outcome of this election, on just how people perceive politics and who can lead. So happy to talk more about this later on, but for now, I will turn it over to Sally Friedman.
Oh, the audio now unmuted.
Okay, so first of all, I use talking software, which is managing to tell me anytime anybody leaves or comes into the meeting. So if you hear weird stuff, I apologize. I do not know how to shut it up. But what I will be louder. But what I wanted to do, what I've been doing over the week, is just looking at the basics. So who is Kamala Harris? Because a lot of it we don't know. So I wanted to talk a little bit about her upbringing, her prosecutorial career, and her Senate run for her Senate experience. And again, happy to answer questions too. And encourage you guys, as I know all of you will, to look for more information about her. So as many of you know, she's born in Oakland. She's biracial with an Indian mother and a Jamaican dad. What I hadn't realized is if you read her autobiography, which I actually have used in class, how important her roots were to her, and how growing up in Oakland, how important the civil rights movement was there in the late 60s, early 70s. So she really was steeped, to the extent she wants to use that, she really was steeped in those traditions early in her life. So I guess that's the part that I knew less about, is, not just that she's biracial, but how important her roots, at least at various times in her life, have been to her. And then I looked at her prosecutorial career. So she's a deputy DA, she's a San Francisco DA, she is state attorney general in California, and man, depending on what you read, you read that she was pretty tough on crime. You read that was a reformist on crime. You read that, in her words, she was smart on crime. So depending on what you read, but there's, is sort of how you think about this, and in any case, controversial. I think the most pro thing that I read about her is that, especially as a Black woman, and that she was tough on crime in the sense that that's what attorney generals were doing at the time, and that's what, and as a Black woman, she had to show that. So, and that for her time, she was pretty progressive. That's the kindest thing that I read. Other people are like just really critical of her. More specifically, I guess the criticism revolves mostly around that she and her office, and sometimes they get separated a little bit, that she and her office prosecuted all kinds of minor and quality of life crimes, for some people leading to that especially Black men were disproportionately affected and put in jail. So she would do things like, I guess she supported body cameras, but she wouldn't propose statewide regulations for them. She wouldn't say that police had to be investigated if there was a civilian shooting. So to start with, she certainly did some tough on crime kind of things. Going and on the other hand, she did some reformist kinds of things. So there was a program back on track where people would people coming out of jail receive particular help. There were She didn't always enforce California's 3-strike laws for nonviolent offenders. So and she opposed the death penalty. So as Attorney General, a mixed record, controversial record. Some of understanding it depends on what you read, I think. And then I looked a little bit at the Senate. And so I think the most interesting thing for me, she was on the Judiciary Committee, which makes sense, Homeland Security and Intelligence. I looked a little bit at her bills sponsored, which according to one source, she had at least, she really had a generalist kind of record. So according to one source, she had 7 issue areas with over 10% of her bills. So she really spread things out. She really spread things out. The top 3 were public lands and resources, which I have a feeling has a lot to do with California, and fires, health, and then crime and criminal justice were the top 3. And I guess the last thing I'll say, and happy to answer questions, I guess in the Senate, and I guess what I learned from that is there's the work of the Senate, right? The committees you're on, the bills you sponsor. She seems to have been best known in her Senate for questioning some of Trump's appointees. Brett Kavanaugh, she's asking him questions about women's bodies, and he doesn't know what the heck to do. She apparently asked Attorney General Barr if he had ever been asked to investigate anyone by the White House to investigate. And he didn't know what to do with that question. So I'll leave it at that. Happy to answer questions. And Justin, you're next.
Hi, I'm Justin Zimmerman, and I spend a lot of time talking about Black political behavior and politics. So that's what I'm going to talk to you all about right now, and race in general, as we go through the conversation. And one of the big things I like to do, how I start a lot of my class, especially when we get to Black political attitudes and participation in electoral politics, is I show my students an SNL skit of when basically replicating white liberals' reaction to Trump about to win. And basically, it's kind of this like optimism. It starts with optimism of, yes, we're going to have our first woman president, Hillary. And then as time goes on and the states start rolling in, this like over fixation on Black enclaves to save democracy from the Trump presidency that would eventually come. So they're looking at Philadelphia, they're looking at Detroit, they're looking at Indianapolis, hoping something happens. And of course, nothing happens, which is of course the joke. Like Black folks can always save democracy in that particular way. But one of the interesting things that comes from Kamala Harris and even Joe Biden is that there has been this renewed energy in Black political behavior and Black political attitudes, particularly with Kamala, and actually seeing a Black woman as president. Now, one of the big things that's coming from this is the power of the Black counterpublic. Now, the Black counterpublic, well, I'm going to start with a good authority quote from Nadia Brown and her team. She starts with comparing Chisholm, Barack Obama, and Barack Obama to Kamala Harris. She states, like Chisholm, Harris has ties to the Black Greek letter organizations, entities with long traditions of promoting civic engagement in the Black community. Harris also has ties to the historically Black colleges, HBCUs, having attended Howard University as an undergrad student. Chisholm and Obama did not attend HBCUs, and Obama is not a member of a Black Greek letter organization. As you all probably already know, through all the pink and greens and the skiwees, that Kamala is a part of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. And that is actually a very big deal when we think about Black political mobilization, particularly for her going for presidency. She's able to tap into, I won't say necessarily more easily, but she's already highly ingrained into Black political counterpublics and organizations. A Black counterpublic being those organizations that help mobilize. So think about the Black church. Think about those Black Greek letter organizations. Think about Black media, barbershops, trade unions, whatever you can think of where Black leadership can help mobilize. She's already tapped into all that, as you all have already seen, where she's been able to raise millions of dollars just off Black folks, particularly the Black elite, who are part of these organizations that want to see her become president. Now, here's the crux of it, though. Though there's a lot of excitement about Kamala Harris, at least from certain Black folks. Emphasis on certain Black folks. She still has a ways to go in really being able to convince people who aren't a part of those organizations, who haven't necessarily gone to those same colleges, who are a little bit more working class, who have gone through the criminal justice system, which Professor Friedman has already alluded to, of her being able to be willing to of them willing to make her president. And that's going to be kind of a tough sell because her record as a prosecutor is going to be a point of criticism for a lot of people who have gone through the criminal justice system, a lot of people who have seen people in prison because of truancy laws, which she helped enforce, and all those things that go into kind of the mix of being both proud of there being a Black woman that can finally become president, but also the systems that she's had to negotiate within in order to get to that point. And that goes into also the complexities that Black folks have with the Democratic Party in general. No, they're not going to suddenly become Republicans because Trump's a white supremacist, and so are most of the people who are currently the leaders of the Republican Party. But that doesn't mean that they'll necessarily vote at all. They can also exit. So what Kamala is going to have to do, what the Democrats are going to have to do, and what the Republicans can do if they ever decide to make a choice for it, is make active choices on how they're going to put together a Black political agenda that puts racial justice at the forefront, economic justice at the forefront, and make sure that Black folks are actually being counted correctly. That will be the challenge for both parties, but particularly the Democrats, who stand obviously the best chance of getting that vote. I'm happy to talk about this further, especially about her being mixed race and talking about the rest of what race looks like in this particular race right now. Anyway, political race. so yeah, looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Okay, I think I'm next up. So I'm Tim Weaver, an associate professor in the political science department. And I hesitate really to say anything because there's no certainty that by the time I finish speaking, there's not going to be a dramatic new development in American politics. But I'm going to plow on in the hope that there are no alerts which flash up on the screen before I get to the end of my short remarks. What I wanted to talk about very briefly were two sort of dimensions to thinking about this turn of events. One is the potential upsides for the Democratic Party of switching to Kamala Harris, and the other is some what I'm thinking about as looming concerns on the horizon. So, firstly, with respect to an upside, which we haven't mentioned yet, or haven't, or only mentioned sort of in passing, is to think about the relative salience of various issues on the political agenda. If it's true, as it may well be and seems to be, that the economic picture continues to improve. There's data out today on economic growth and inflation, which point in that direction. It could mean that the relative salience of economic questions, which usually are front and center in most presidential elections, become a little bit lower down the list. And what will they likely be replaced by? I think probably one of those, which has worked quite well for the Democrats in recent elections, has been the issue of reproductive rights, and further to that, the issue of healthcare. And those were two issues which Democrats ran on in 2022 with relative success, given the state of the economy at the time. And of course, then the question is, well, who in the Democratic Party would be well placed to prosecute the case with respect to women's reproductive rights? Not so much Biden, but most certainly Kamala Harris. And in fact, if we look at her activities and speeches in the last few months, it's those areas where she seemed to be the most strong and potent, and of course will draw the greatest contrast between the ticket, the Trump-Vance ticket. So I do think that the relative shift in the salience of different items on the agenda could actually well play in favorably for the Democrats as we approach November, particularly if the Federal Reserve cuts interest rates, as I think they probably will in September. The other thing to note is that and I think someone touched on this briefly, but the Trump administration, or rather I should say the Trump candidate, has made a big mistake, in my view, by nominating Vance as his vice president, and that this mistake has been compounded now that Biden has left the top of the ticket. The contrast is going to be so striking. Both Trump and Vance are on record, of course, with lots of misogyny, and Vance won't help at all to balance Trump's views or Trump's behavior. They both seem to be two peas from a similar pod in that respect. And I think, therefore, this is likely to help the Democratic Party rather than hurt it. Although I think there's a lot at stake, as Cammie hinted at earlier, as to who will be nominated for the VPs on the Democratic side. But I think almost all of the current contenders will compare favorably with Vance. And then the final kind of big positive sign so far is that polls, which tend to move fairly slowly, have seemed to shift somewhat decisively. They've all gone in the same direction, and it's in the direction favoring Democrats. And in a sense, we might have anticipated the polls to be quite favorable towards Trump, given the convention bounce of 2 to 3 points, which tends to be seen right after a convention. And of course, with the shooting, which I think will have put him in a slightly more sympathetic light, at least to some voters. And so in a way, I imagine that Harris's ceiling is somewhat higher than the rating she's currently getting in the polls. Whereas my sense is that Trump is at or very close to his ceiling. As a result, the map, which was looking pretty bad for the Democrats, it looked like places like Georgia and Arizona were probably out of contention, and it was going to be a fight in the Midwest, which is perhaps one reason why Trump went for Vance. Well, now the map maybe looks a bit different, and now the Republicans, I think, are going to have to be worrying about North Carolina. They're going to have to be spending money there. They're going to have to be thinking carefully about Arizona, and I think that Georgia is very much back in play. So in other words, I think there are more paths now open to the Democrats than there were a week ago. So that means that the Republicans are going to have to worry about where they're playing defense. So those are the upsides. Now, however, I do think it's worth just pausing for a moment to think about some potential concerns. The first really has to do with the fact that because Biden waited so long to make what now looks like a rather inevitable decision, it means that the regular process, the democratic process for selecting a presidential candidate, has been short-circuited. And as a result, it means that there are just a lot of unknowns with respect to Harris, unknowns about what it looks like for her to be seriously considered at the top of the ticket. So far, it looks good in the polling, but who knows? We don't know really. Also, had we had a serious primary earlier in which she was a potential candidate, I think she would have come out stronger from that, even if she were to end up winning. Also, she would have been ready with tried and tested campaign messaging, which she doesn't have right now. She's testing some, as it were, on the fly, some of which are landing quite well so far. But had she been through a more rigorous process during a genuine primary, or even a mini primary, which some people were thinking about just up to a couple of weeks ago, then I think she would have probably emerged as a stronger candidate with better message testing than she currently has. And so therefore it's going to have to be a very, very quick turnaround, and they're going to have to make some bets pretty early on about which messages to emphasize, which may turn out not to be effective. There's also, of course, the question of how she will be defined. And the Republicans are already trying to define her. And the race really is to work out who wins the race between definition. And the efforts that Republicans will make will be to define her as a San Francisco liberal, as somebody who has allowed immigrants in at the border, because even though this might not be quite right, they'll say, well, she was the border czar, and hasn't that been a disaster? So she's going to have some clear questions to answer about both her record in California, which I think is more easy to deal with because of her record as a prosecutor and DA. But I think the question on A, her record on immigration, and B, what her proposals are for immigration, are going to cause some difficult questions. And so therefore, I do think that there are some issues on the horizon, which means that it's going to certainly not be plain sailing. It's going to be a big fight to November. And what we don't know is how Harris is likely to hold up in that fight, because the only real time we've seen her tested was in the previous primary in 2019-20, when she withdrew before a single vote was cast. So in other words, I think there's a lot of potential upsides for the Harris candidacy, a potential high ceiling, but there are real questions and real challenges, and we really don't know how this is going to end up. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much to all of our experts. I know that I have learned quite a lot just in the last few minutes here. We had a few questions that came in before the panel, most of which have been answered. There was one question noting that there's been some reporting that more voters have switched to undecided since Harris became the Democratic presumptive candidate, and asking where are those undecided responses coming from. I heard a report this morning suggesting that a lot of those folks who are switching to undecided were actually people who were considering supporting a third-party candidate. There are a number of people who have been saying all along, we don't want a rerun of the 2020 election. We don't like Biden. We don't like Trump. We want something else. And some of those people were going to third-party candidates or were rather reluctantly supporting either Trump or Biden. But those third-party folks seem to be providing most of the people who are now saying that they are undecided. If you did submit a question prior to this and you feel like we haven't covered it, please go ahead and put that in the chat. But I see we do have a couple of questions that I would like to kick out to our panelists. And then I will get to you as soon as I can, Andrea. We have a first question noting that successful candidates in recent years have been kind of outsiders in one way or another with less federal experience or overall political experience. Is this something that could benefit Harris if she's not seen as much as an insider, somebody like Joe Biden, who's been serving in the federal government for many, many years? I guess
Oh,
I would, yeah, go ahead, Justin.
I wasn't sure. I'm like, are we waiting for people? Well, I mean, I don't necessarily think of Kamala as not an insider, though. She's been in government for a good, it's been 20, 30 years, I believe, that she's been in government. So I don't know if she's necessarily what I would consider an outsider. Now, Trump was an outsider. Trump was sitting there hosting The Apprentice as he was running for president. But I'm joking, being a little facetious. But like Trump is one of the few true outsiders that ran successfully for president that I can think of in recent memory. Barack Obama wasn't an outsider in any real way. I mean, he had the backing of not necessarily a machine, but a very powerful Chicago Democratic, sorry, I can't think of a different word for it, machine that helped him get to where he got to before another, though she wasn't in government, Michelle Obama, who had great connections and was very much a part of the black elite that was able to get him some type of credibility. I think Kamala kind of falls, not in the Barack Obama sense, but falls into the same realm of someone that she's very well connected politically. She's not really an outsider. Now, what makes her an outsider is her identity, maybe, and in the sense that we have no examples of a black woman that is also Indian becoming president, because that hasn't happened. So she's an outsider in that way, but I don't know if that necessarily helps her, because what we do know is that, particularly and I'll say this from the fact of black candidates, and I saw a question in there like, why are we focusing on our Indian identity? And I'll get to that point in a second, because part of the issue is racial hierarchies, right? And it's about how people perceive you and where you are in a socially constructed world of how we think about identity. And the fact of the matter is, most people see her as a black woman, and she honestly presents herself as a black woman more times than not. Particularly when she talks about emphasizes her time at Howard, emphasizes her time as an AKA. Those are very like black. I'm from Oakland. Black ways of talking about things. But in particular, what that does is that it puts her in a position where she's gonna have a lot of challenges. What we know about black candidates is that they find themselves kind of in this, particularly because Barack Obama is the best example of this, because he's the only one to get through, that he had deracialized at times. So at times he had to emphasize that he was black, and at times he had to let it go and be like, well, my mother is from Kansas. So she's going to find herself in the same position when it comes to trying to balance how she shows her identities and to what group she shows it to. But also the issue is with her being an outsider, particularly because of her race and her gender, is how people perceive her as radical or not. So in my opinion, she took a swing today or yesterday in just talking about the fact of the injustices that are going on in Gaza. And we'll see whether that pays off or not. For the young people, it may. For other folks, it may turn them off. These are all things that become an issue because of race and gender, but particularly race. Because when you're an African American candidate, when you're a Jamaican American, she's a Black American. When you're a black candidate, the issues is that people are already assuming that you're already more radicalized than you may already be, and these are the issues that she's going to deal with. So, in the sense of how she is an outsider because of her identity, is not necessarily helpful to her. If anything, it can hurt her and put her in a position where she won't get the necessary votes that she needs. That was very long. I'm happy to ask questions about that because that was long. Sorry.
We do have a couple more questions in the chat, but Andrea, did you have a question that you wanted to raise? Because you had your hand.
Sure. I'm Andrea Smith. I'm an alum of the Rockefeller College with my MPA, and you guys have done a great job today. Thank you. I heard in the Biden's comments that he will, between now and the end of his term, propose changes for the Supreme Court. How does him doing that help Kamala as a candidate?
I guess this one's for me, since I'm the courts person. It will help her in a number of ways. First, at this point, Supreme Court curbing or Supreme Court reform is a very popular policy agenda among Democrats. So that is going to generate more enthusiasm and possibly drive turnout for the Democrats, which is obviously a big priority. The other issue here is, as I mentioned, the potential for lawsuits around the Harris campaign. One thing that John Roberts and his colleagues will be watching is the extent to which there seems to be real energy around Congress passing legislation that actively curbs the court. If we go back historically, we find that the moments when the court has tended to pull back and change course have been moments when there have been realistic threats that Congress was going to act. We saw this to some extent in the 1930s, the famous switch in time that saved 9. It's a little bit of a myth, but the other moment that hasn't been discussed as much when people are talking about this is that the Warren Court had a similar experience. When they were facing the threat of congressional curbing, they did pull back on some of their full-throated support for freedom of speech and for stopping prosecution and pursuit of people suspected of involvement with the Communist Party. So if Supreme Court reform is actively on the table, that may have an influence on the way that the court deals with any potential issues that come up. Couple more questions in here. Democratic primary, a little primary, real quick one. Do people think that's possible and or realistic? And what might be the impact once people start looking into Harris's voting record in the Senate and see that she has tended for the most part to vote with Democrats and vote for liberal policies?
I can speak to the first one. I think at this point, she is the consensus nominee. The Obamas endorsed her today, had Biden and Pelosi and all of the main biggest names in the Democratic Party. So I don't think, and there hasn't been anyone step up to say, I am challenging her. So I think at this point, I would be surprised if there was any sort of mini primary.
Hold the audio now unmuted.
And I'll
Smith to everyone. Bolin, thank you, Lee Harris, for all this game.
I'll speak to the second one about the Senate. I mean, I think, as Professor Weaver said, you know, her perception of her liberal voting record and her voting with the Democratic Party are certainly, you know, I'm not sure that she voted as liberally as she gets talked about, but certainly those are Republican talking points that, you know, that they will bring up, and as campaigners they should. So I think that question is a good one.
I suspect that may affect the direction she goes with her vice presidential pick as well. If she pursues a traditional ticket balancing strategy, that may push her towards someone who's perceived as being more of a moderate. Youth vote. What do you all think? Does Harris's efforts to put herself in a somewhat different position on the Gaza situation place her to energize more youth voters? How do you imagine her walking this line?
No, I think I could jump in on this one just to say that it's clear that already she's repositioning the message on Gaza. And so I think she got a headline she would have been looking for yesterday, saying that she, you know, expressed major concerns while Netanyahu was here. And I think that will go some way to helping with the youth vote and also the uncommitted vote, which was quite large in some swing states, Michigan, I think, and Wisconsin in particular. So getting those uncommitted people to recommit to voting on the Democratic ticket is going to be front and center on the agenda. And I also just think that we've seen just in the polling, the percentage of voters aged 18 to 34 who plan to vote Democratic has gone up by double digits. And so part of that will have to do with a shift on Gaza, but another part of it will just be she's a younger person, she's a different generation, she's able to prosecute the case effectively in a way that Biden unfortunately was not.
Polling data on RFK Jr. There was a there was a poll just very recently done suggesting that this is a real game changer in terms of RFK. The entrance of Harris for Biden seems like, at least at this very early moment, to be pulling a lot of those third-party votes. And there was actually an analysis suggesting that if we look at this moment in time, this particular snapshot, but everything's still very uncertain, if RFK were to stay in the race, he would be taking more votes from Trump than from Harris. If you look at just the two of them, Trump is still a bit ahead, but if third-party candidates are still in the race, that actually puts Harris a little bit ahead in the polls. Again, a lot of statistical noise, so I think you want to be a little careful with this, but looks like it's definitely going to be damaging to Trump if RFK stays in. Just having a Jewish husband help Kamala Harris if she does move toward more empathy toward Gaza and more pressure on Netanyahu.
I guess I'm the race guy, but I have absolutely no idea. So what happened with Barack Obama? So this question kind of reminds me of what people talk about Barack Obama, because, you know, Barack Obama for a very long time in his life, and this is something he talks about in his book, he didn't fully identify with his Black race all the way, or really had kind of a difficulty with it. And one of the things that really brought Obama into the forefront of Black support was him just having two Black daughters and a black wife. So I'm assuming you kind of mean around those type of things, where will the identity of the spouse be enough to be enough for them to be like, cool, that's fine. And what I can tell you about race in general is that probably not. Black people in America are pretty unique in how they use linked fate and how they use Black political consciousness, because of the way we've been disenfranchised in this country, in the United States, which allows for figuring out how people are going to interact and how they're going to mobilize. Dawson came up with this concept called linked fate, which is basically if everyone else thinks it's, when there's no other information, what's good for the group must be good for me because I'm Black. I don't necessarily know if Jewish people, based on all the research I I don't necessarily think Jewish people have linked fate in that way, partly because Jewishness is in part about whiteness, but it's also, there are Jewish people who aren't white. There are Jewish people who have different political aspirations of conservative and Democrat. There are just other things going on that aren't necessarily the same thing that you would see with like a Michelle Obama, which is assuming, that's where my assumption is where that question's coming from. Is there that spouse that can inoculate some of the hesitation they may have? And what I could say is that probably not. I can't really tell based on this because I don't know much about that. But in general, I would think, though, that you're not going to see the same thing that you would see with Michelle Obama, who's able to help move a particular group in one direction or the other. I don't think so.
I would also just add in that AIPAC and some of the very, very hard right conservative Jews, not religiously conservative, but politically conservative Jews, have been very vocal about attacking left-wing Jews who have a different perspective on Gaza. So I would suspect that that is not going to cut her much ice. We are almost at time. If there's one more question, we can probably take a swing at it. But if, okay, who's going to win? Oh, that's a tough one. All right, everybody, closing statements. I will just, maybe we can go in the reverse order that we presented. Tim, that puts you up first.
I think that Trump is his own worst enemy. And I think Harris is going to win because he's going to depress his favorable rating the more he speaks.
Okay.
I think we're gonna find out if the Bradley effect is still a real substantive theory. Uh, and what I'm saying basically is it is nice that everyone is showing this energy for a Black mixed race woman to become president, but sometimes people don't always follow through. So we're gonna find out. I do not know. It would be unprecedented. As usual, Kamala comes under the top, having to hit the highest levels of performing under the worst circumstances, which many Black women end up having to do in their professional careers. So this is going to be a very tough race. You cannot underestimate the power of racism and sexism, as we found out in 2016. And it's gonna be a dogfight. You all think that it's bad with them saying she's a DEI hire. It's gonna get worse than that. So we will see. I hope.
All the audio now unmuted.
I'm going with Harris because I want to. But I think everything Justin just said is right on target. And if nothing else, at least Harris has made a race of it. But I'm going with Harris because I'd like to think that's the vision of America that, speaking as myself, that I would like to see.
I feel like you all are my extended family asking me how the race is going to turn out. I don't know. If I had to put money on it, which I am not betting on this race, I would say Harris, just because I think more of the opinions on Trump are baked in at this point. And Harris is less known than Trump is, and because of that, there is more room for improvement on her end.
All right. I will say that, guys, it's July. It's July. We have so long to go before we get to the point where people actually start turning their ballots in. And it's going to feel like a really, really long time. I agree that this is going to be an exceptionally ugly race, one of the ugliest in American history. It is likely to be a very close race. But as we're watching what's happening on the ground in the electoral struggle, keep in mind that there will be a lot happening outside of people casting votes. There will be efforts to portray the outcome in valid and incorrect ways. There will be efforts to tilt the table. There's going to be more litigation. Ultimately, it will come down to which party can energize its followers more effectively and which party can ensure that those votes that come in for that party are the ones that end up making that determination. You've mentioned you might want to see some more of these. We are going to be planning more events as we move forward toward the election. So do please stay tuned. And I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon and thank our wonderful, wonderful panelists for their insights.